All right, we move ahead to our next guest. In fact, he was the very first guest in the history of this program, and this is long overdue to get him back on. Jon Anik, play-by-play voice for the UFC, Anik and Florian podcast. And I don't know what was more of a talking point on Saturday night, Max Holloway's hair or the mustache of Jon Anik. It was all over social media. But, John, good to see you, man. How are you?
It's good to see you, man. You've been killing it since joining MMAfighting.com, so I'm happy to see that. But, yeah, the mustache thing, us play-by-play guys, we're trying to sort of fall firmly underneath the radar, and I can grow a full beard in 48 hours. So I didn't really even notice that the mustache was a little bit thicker than normal. But now certainly we have to go Casey Leiden style and go like complete mustache in Abu Dhabi. So that's the plan.
There you go. And we haven't really spoken like this since before the April 18th iteration of UFC 249 was postponed. And you've got to call some big ones over the last couple of months. And, I guess my first question is, what has it been like from a broadcasting perspective, going from full arenas, capacity crowds to 15,000 seat arenas with no one to fill the seats, and then to the UFC Apex?
Well, Jacksonville was a lot different than Vegas has been. We did not have the hockey plexiglass in Jacksonville, so our every word was being heard by the fighters. It was interesting to talk to Dustin Poirier after the fight, to hear from him that he seemed to hear most of what we were saying and said it was echoing off the walls. So that kind of is what it is. I mean, I am trying to be a little bit more measured at times when I'm relaying corner man advice or things that I think would be blatant in terms of a fighter wanting to hear what we have to say. But that's been the biggest part of the adjustment for us. Certainly when I got to go take a piss, it's a lot nicer that I don't have to navigate fans and things like that. But I miss the fans dearly. I've said to you and others that the fans are a performance enhancer for the announcers. It's not a crutch, right? But it's certainly something you lean into when you have the benefit of a live event audience. So I can't wait till we have fans again. But at this point in this climate, I don't think we'll see fans in 2020. And I think I speak for a lot of my broadcast partners when I say we've gotten pretty conditioned to calling fights in empty arenas.
One thing that I've noticed, and I have three brothers, and none of them were MMA fans at all. Like, they casually watch. I have a little brother who just watches it just because he likes to bet on anything. So he bets on fights, which I'm sure you can appreciate. But I think all three of them throughout this process, because of the empty arena and getting to really hear what happens in a fight outside of the crowd, like from the breathing to the strikes landing to receiving a body shot, they've really grown to appreciate the sport a lot more than they did before this all began. Have you sort of noticed that as well, that people are really starting to, I guess, appreciate the sport more now that there's no fans and they get to really feel like they're in there in a way?
Yeah, I think you hit on a lot of good points there. I mean, the Poirier Hooker numbers, the early returns are that we did a great number there. And my social media is a pretty good direct indicator when I get it off the air, depending on how many mentions I have a pretty good idea as to what our television rating was. So I think there's been some fan retention. I think guys like your brothers who are maybe watching us in early May, watching UFC 249, now they're tuning in every week. So I think the question for me is, how much of that audience are we going to be able to retain once these other sports are back up and running? But it's hugely encouraging, obviously, and the fighters deserve all the credit. I think the 25-foot octagon is getting more credit than it deserves. The fighters, I think, deserve a lot of the credit. Certainly the numbers suggest that there are more finishes in this little guy, but the athletes have really delivered. I don't think training camps have been compromised the way a lot of people felt like they would be. So you're still getting high-level mixed martial arts, and as much as I miss my kids, I've been thankful to have a front row seat for most of it.
There you go. And I have to say, John, you've been a part of a lot of events over the years. Your voice is synonymous with some of the best fights and the biggest moments in the history of the sport, and you always do a great job. But to me, I thought this past Saturday night was one of those nights for you that we're going to be talking about for a long time. Like, from the calls to the post-fight interviews, most notably with Maurice Green and Mike Perry. I thought it was really incredible. So I don't know about you. I don't know how you feel about specific nights and specific cards, but when the night ended and you're heading back to the hotel, did it feel like it was one of those special nights in your career?
Well, it means a lot to hear you say that. And yeah, I mean, I think it feels special. We can sort of have a tendency to not enjoy the fruits of our labor and just spin it forward to the next show and bury it as quickly as we can, because there's so much work that has to be done, sometimes 2 weeks in advance, to get ready for the next show. But, my boss, Zach Candido, called me a couple days after the show and said how happy he was with the post-fight interviews. I don't always get that phone call, so that meant a whole lot to me. But a lot of it is rooted in the preparation, right? In knowing the stories intimately of guys like Kamaru and Maurice Green, so that when they win a fight, you know what the context is. And I didn't know that the Crochet boss was going to be that emotional after the fact, but I do know that him moving his family to New Mexico, Mike, was contingent upon the win bonus, on winning that fight, right? So his kids are starting school in a month, right? I mean, these are big decisions, right? And it's not like his son is 3 years old. His son is 8 or 9 years old, right? There are lives that are impacted by the outcomes of these fights. And so I was very happy for Maurice to have that moment, and that he was able to sort of, share his story with everyone. And for Kamaru, bro, it's like his gym in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Hopefully it gets a boost from this, but it was an inch away from closing during this pandemic. So these are the stories that mean a lot to me. A play-by-play guy is charged with a lot of things over 7 hours of a live event, but number one for me is trying to humanize these athletes so that people out there give a rip. And I think at least when it comes to Maurice and Kama, their fan bases took a nice swell this weekend. So, it was a special show, and Poirier obviously, cementing his Hall of Fame legacy in my mind. It was a great event.
Yeah, and this will be the last question about broadcasting, because I'm a broadcasting geek and I love having these conversations. But, you've been in the game for a long time now on the broadcasting side. It's been around 7 or so years for me, and it's kind of a lost art in this industry. And I see it a lot with some of the up-and-coming guys, that when these moments are happening and these stories are being told, whether it's in the fight itself or when you're just speaking to the fighters, to know when to sort of like lay out and just like let the moment happen. The silence can sometimes be louder than your actual words themselves. You know what I mean? And I think you did such a great job at that on Saturday night, Jon. I mean, that's something that I feel is a lost art in this industry.
Well, I appreciate it, man. Sincerely, I really do. Television and radio are different beasts, right? This is a television call. And even if you don't have crowd noise, you have to let certain moments breathe and be comfortable in your own silence. Even if you look at the interview with Platinum Mike Perry, right? And thankfully, I got great producers who laid out as well. It's not like they were telling me that I had to intervene at any point during that interview, but we're witnessing gold. Mike Perry versus the tax man, right? This was perfect, right? There's no reason for me to say anything. And I do think if you're able to check your ego and be a good listener, then it can pay off in a live TV setting. So to have someone like you acknowledge it a few days after the fact is not lost on me. But I would be lying if I said it's not on to Fight Island. I mean, I do have no choice but to bury these quickly. I'm doing July 11th and July 15th, 2 shows in 5 days. So we have turned the page, my man, to say the least.
Yeah, I do want to ask you, we'll go on to Fight Island, I promise.
No, but, of course.
Yeah, because the last time you were on, we discussed briefly about Zhang Weili versus Ioana Jędrzejczyk, and you said that was the best fight that you've had the privilege to sit cage side for. And since then, we've seen Justin Gaethje versus Tony Ferguson. What a wild fight that was. And as good as that was, not sure if it really eclipsed the strawweight title fight. But Dan Hooker versus Dustin Poirier, that one might have done it for Fight of the Year for me. Like, I watched both of those fights back to back on Monday, and I'm leaning towards Poirier Hooker, maybe just because both guys are so close to being finished. That could change tomorrow, Jon, but you called both of those fights. Do you think Poirier versus Hooker surpassed that one?
All right, so I will answer that question. But first, I just want to say, for Josh Emmett and Shane Burgos, right, a 3-rounder versus a 5-rounder. Had that fight been a main event over 25 minutes, which it easily could have been, that fight might be in the conversation as well. But I think it's hard. Even Vicente Luque versus Nico Price, a 3-round fight that ends quickly. It's hard to hold up in the Fight of the Year conversation. I think, excuse me, Mike, the biggest difference for me was that when it went to the scorecards for Zhang Weili and Ioana Jędrzejczyk, we didn't know who won, and there was a belt on the line. And even though I thought Zhang Weili probably won the fight, it was wicked close. Whereas in Poirier Hooker, over the final 10 minutes, Dan Hooker really did fade, and it was all heart for him to power through that exhaustion and see the final horn. So I didn't know that we had the ebb and flow over the final 10 minutes in Poirier Hooker. For me, that makes it hold up with Zhang Weili and Ioana Jędrzejczyk, and I can't get past Ioana's forehead and her fighting through that. So the ladies have not been dethroned in the Fight of the Year conversation for me. And again, I have more respect for Dan Hooker than anybody almost in the fight game. I mean, that dude I put on a pedestal, but I just think that after the war with Felder, just that round 5, man, he just had nothing left, you know?
Yeah, and what's great about a fight like that is that although Dustin Poirier won, I feel like Dan Hooker's stock rose quite a bit in that fight. And having a guy like Justin Gaethje saying, "Great fight, you deserve a seat at the big dog table," that's huge for a guy like Dan Hooker. Even with the loss, if there's a silver lining anywhere, there it is.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think some people suggest that maybe Dan Hooker doesn't have a championship ceiling now. I'm not willing to go that far. He has fewer miles on the tank than Poirier. He's still a guy who I think is a force to be reckoned with in this division. I just think that when you go through a fight like he did against Edson Barboza, his team made him take 8 or 9 months off. Then he goes through the war with Paul Felder. He was willing to turn around and fight Poirier May 16th. Right? Thankfully, it ended up being June 27th, but I do believe when you go through those type of fights, the more time you can take off in between, the better it can be. So I think a Hooker-Poirier rematch down the line would be super competitive. And again, I think Eugene Bareman will make some improvements and modifications with Dan Hooker. But the cardio abandonment to me was really just pure exhaustion and maybe just turning around a little too soon after that Felder war in late February.
Absolutely. And now it is on to Fight Island for you. It all kicks off July 11th, UFC 251. And, talk about a guy whose stock rose during the Vegas residency. Gilbert Burns gets a big win over Tyron Woodley. He jumps up to the top contender spot at 170 and now has a chance to become a world champion when he faces Kamaru Usman in the main event. And I think it's so crazy that like a year ago, I think it was August of last year, he's fighting Alexei Kunchenko, and now he's about to go to Fight Island and fight for a world title. Like Durinho has a huge task ahead of him, but man, he's become one of the best stories in the sport, is he not?
Dude, I mean, absolutely. What an improbable run to welterweight prominence, right? This is a guy who got knocked out by Dan Hooker in the summer of 2018. And had that not happened, maybe he wouldn't have put his focus into the welterweight division. It's hard for me to talk about this fight without just thinking about the friendship between Kamaru Usman and Gilbert Burns, right? Because Kamaru has cornered Gilbert before. Like, they're teammates, they're longtime teammates, they're friends, and I do think that it is a part of this fight. When Kama Worthy knocked out Devontae Smith last year and turned in what was on paper the biggest upset of the year, I think part of that was a byproduct of familiarity, that he was so comfortable with Devontae Smith that he was just not at all fazed by the environment or the pressure or the UFC debut. He felt like it was a sparring session. So for me, that's a disadvantage for the incumbent, for the champion, right? Some people would say it's neither here nor there. It's not an advantage for one guy or the other. But I think for Kamaru, who's 11-0 in the UFC, he was untouched before the Colby Covington fight. Now he's fighting a guy that knows his every move. So I think it was hugely smart for Kamaru to get the hell out of South Florida, to go to Trevor Whitman, who is the consensus best in the game, right? And really try to get a change of scenery and focus on turning Gilbert Burns into an enemy. Because every time there's been an enemy in the UFC, Kamaru Usman has dominated that party. I think it's going to be a kickboxing match. I think Kamaru probably doesn't want to mess around too much in the guard of the great Gilbert Durinho Burns. And some people say Burns is the better striker. I'm not so sure, but I think it's going to be a kickboxing match.
Yeah, I can't wait for that fight. Three title fights total on the card. We got Usman versus Burns. We got Volkanovski versus Holloway in a rematch for the featherweight strap. And then we have Piotr Jan versus Jose Aldo for the vacant bantamweight title. All of them have very interesting storylines attached to them. But if you had to pick one, John, which one of these 3 title fights, I guess, fascinates you the most?
Definitely the rematch between Alexander Volkanovski and Max Holloway, because when we sat down with Volko before the first Holloway fight, he sort of had this feeling, like a lot of guys do coming into their first UFC title fight against a long-reigning champion, that he was going to have to beat Max Holloway twice. Now, I'm not saying that Eugene Bareman and the City Kickboxing guys held back necessarily the first time around, but they knew they were going to have to beat this guy twice. So perhaps a lot of people are focusing on the Holloway adjustments and not thinking about Volkanovski's game plan and how he might approach a second fight differently. So fascinated to see what the consensus greatest featherweight of all time, Max Holloway, can do to try to force the issue and make this a different fight. Because even though he did rally late, one of those judges had 50-45 for Volko. He gave Volkanovski all 5 rounds, and I kind of saw it that way too. I mean, maybe there was a round for Max in there late, but I saw an argument that Volkanovski had a clean sweep that night. So Holloway's got to make a lot of adjustments. I think Volkanovski will come with a tweaked game plan as well, and just absolutely fascinated by championship rematches anyway. And then, of course, for Piotr Jan, what a stud, man. If he can beat Jose Aldo to begin the Jan era, no better way to do it. So, yeah, as much as I have to do hurdle-wise to get to Abu Dhabi in terms of nasal swabs and everything else, as you can see, I can't wait to get there and see these fights play out on the island.
Yeah, the whole card's really good. You got Andrade versus Namajunas 2. You got Amanda Ribas versus Paige Van Zandt. The featured prelim on that card, Volkan Ozdemir versus Yuri Prochazka. Good Lord, man. You get to call that fight. I'm so excited for that one.
Yeah, there's a lot of hype behind that young man. And Volkan Ozdemir is a totally different guy than he was a couple years ago, physically, mentally. So that's a great fight and really is one of our deeper pay-per-views. I think we're all going to look back at UFC 249 and think, man, how is that not, at least on paper, the card of the year? But again, you're talking about 5 main events on this pay-per-view, 3 title fights. Championship triple headers are pretty rare in the UFC, I think 6 or 7 times all told. And then Ribas Van Zandt certainly is a headline-worthy fight for an ESPN fight night. And then the rematch between Namajunas and Andrade feels like a title fight to me. So we're absolutely loaded. The weird thing for me, Mike, and I know you'll appreciate this, dude, my call time is 1 a.m. local time in Abu Dhabi, right? When we went in September, we catered to the Abu Dhabi audience, right? So it was in their realm. This time around, we're catering to the American TV audience, 10 p.m. Eastern pay-per-view. So 3 a.m. first fight, bro. So we'll be sleeping all day, waking up in the middle of the night, and cracking a mic at 3 o'clock in the morning. Caffeine's a powerful thing, but it's going to be interesting at 3:05 a.m., I can assure you.
There you go. True or false, the most under-the-radar fight on Fight Island is Deiveson Figueiredo versus Joseph Benavidez.
I think so, because I could sit here and talk to you about Calvin Cade or Dan Ige until I'm blue in the face, because in some other media I've been asked, what's the off-the-radar fight that you're most excited for? I feel weird mentioning a main event, but Cade or Ige is a great fight, and to see 2 featherweights who are willing right now to put their candidacy on the line against each other with all that momentum, I just have a lot of respect for those guys, because the loser, 2-year setback potentially in terms of your championship aspirations. Any way you slice it. Shane Burgos loses to Josh Emmett, 2-year setback in terms of your championship aspirations. But yeah, Benavidez Figueiredo, I think it's more competitive than the odds makers suggest. I saw Benavidez as a 2-1 underdog. I think he deserves more respect than that. And even though he was the guy who is probably guilty for the headbutt happening, it was a factor in the fight. So we'll see if Figueiredo can make weight. Hopefully he can. He's an absolute monster at 25. But there's an asterisk. You have to make the weight to be the monster at 25, and cautiously optimistic that he will.
Yeah, Cater's hilarious. I spoke with him the other day, and he shot me a text like right after the fight card was announced. It was like, when you post everything in the start times, is that right? Does that mean I'm fighting at like 6 a.m.? Yeah. I was like, yep. I was like, I guess I'm right. I'm like, that's what the thing showed on the broadcast when you guys are announcing the card. But yeah, there you are. Get ready, man. But obviously, very exciting stuff. And honestly, John, to see what the UFC has done over these last few months, because let's be honest, there weren't a lot of people overly enthused at the beginning of this all that they were even doing the right thing. And I didn't go on Twitter and start slamming the UFC or anything like that, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't have my reservations. They proved me wrong. They proved a lot of people wrong. So to be a part of this train that has just kept on moving during the craziest year that I've been alive for, what has that been like for you?
It's been a wild ride. I mean, I would be lying if I said there wasn't some anxiety for me in early April when I was wrapping my head around getting from South Florida to Lemoore, California, given what the climate was back then. But if you're Dana White and the UFC brass, you have to be bullish. You have to not fear failure. Managing risk the whole time, but you have to be willing to fail to try to execute in this climate. And I sound like a broken record when I talk about the UFC as this well-oiled machine that deals with all these different global challenges and variables wherever we go, losing a fight day of, Amanda Nunes, pulling out, or Robert Whittaker a few hours before we're to go live. People have no idea the live production ramifications that we've dealt with in the past. And even though this global pandemic is unforeseen, I just felt like if any organization was going to figure out a way to get shows off the ground, it was the UFC. And even though we don't have some of the obstacles that the other sports leagues have, it's still a challenge to get a show off in this climate. And we've done 20% of our live event schedule. We've done 8 of 40 events from May 9th to June 27th. So there have been a few positive tests here or there, but I think the promotion deserves credit. And I'll admit, and maybe you saw this on my Instagram this morning, I'm a little bit surprised that the other sports leagues not only haven't solicited opinions from the UFC or followed suit with the UFC, but how about acknowledging Dana White and giving the guy and his executives some credit for getting shows off the ground in a climate where other people have been massively passive and have had their trepidation maybe get in the way of getting off the ground. I think these other organizations need to look at the UFC and say, man, I know we have teams and things like that, but why are they having success and we're still trying to figure out how to get one show in the can?
Yeah, it's crazy to see what they've done. And, like we talked about earlier, more people are watching now, which is great. And hopefully as these fight cards continue to go on, because there hasn't been a dud event yet. They've all been really good. Even the ones, a lot of people were poo-pooing the Calvillo versus I card, but that turned out to be really, really good at the end of the day. It's never judge a book by its cover, John. I think that's what we've learned through this whole thing.
Dude, you're so right. We could do 25 minutes easily just talking about the prelims from that Poirier Hooker card. You know what I mean? You got all these guys, these underdogs, the Julian Erosa story, riding his bike in Vegas, hoping to get a call 1-4 in the UFC and goes out and beats a guy as a plus 400 underdog. It truly is the land of the unpredictable, the theater of the unknown. And the NFL better get back soon, because you know me, the NFL is king, but the greatest sport in the world might be taken over if football doesn't come back soon.
Yes. Perfect segue. Cam Newton, New England Patriots. Big news. Very interesting move for both parties. What do you think?
I think the Patriots offensive coordinator, Josh McDaniels, was always going to try to get a really mobile quarterback once the Tom Brady era was over. So we'll see if Cam Newton can beat out Jarrett Stidham for the job. I think he'll win the job if he's healthy and ready to go. And I also think Cam Newton can be coachable and can fall in line and can adhere to the playbook and be a good soldier. And if not return to the MVP level, certainly help the Patriots win the AFC East and be viable. The one thing you knew about Bill Belichick, that he was not going to punt on the season. And when Brian Hoyer is your backup, you're punting on the season, right? He's the worst backup in the NFL. If anything happens to Jarrett Stidham, Brian Hoyer is your quarterback, and that puts you in a position where you are not going to be making the playoffs. So I couldn't be happier. Hopefully Cam Newton is healthy, and with respect to his fellow Auburn guy Stidham, I hope Cam Newton wins the job.
Yeah, I hope he can check his ego at the door, Just keep an open mind. We've seen some of these big names come in, and then 2 weeks into camp, they're just like, nope,
right,
can't do this. So
it's low risk, and if they cut him early, maybe I wouldn't be totally surprised. If you're asking me today, do I think he wins the job? I think it's like a 55-45 proposition. I'm not sure, if he's going to beat out Stidham, but we'll see.
I think he's the opening day starter, and then go from there.
Oh, let's go. I hope you're right.
Me too. But I can't thank you enough, John. We could do this, like you said, for another couple of hours, no problem. But you got some traveling to prepare for. So I want you to enjoy the time with your family before you head out. Safe travels, and can't wait to hear you on these broadcasts, man. All the best to you.
Thank you, buddy. I'll be in touch when I got boots on the ground, and continued success, man. Nobody happier to see it than me.